Hi everyone. Our topic for this day is an interesting topic because we'll talk about the nervous system. And as we will learn more about later, the nervous system is comprised of the brain, the spinal cord, the different nerves, and we'll talk about how should they communicate with one another so that the body can maintain homeostasis and maintain the conditions inside our body at levels that are appropriate for survival. Once again, I'm Dr. Mikhail Nesembuhay and hope you would be able to learn something for today. So as mentioned, the task, the responsibility of the nervous system is really complex. It's sometimes really hard to imagine how the nervous system works, the coordination that we need for dancing, maybe some of you are into TikTok or dancing, some of you uh, into music, singing, and then sometimes we're sad, we're angry, and that there are different emotions that come into play. And the nervous system is just really amazing how it incorporates all the information that we are certain of, and even the information that we are not conscious of. So we'll learn more about the nervous system, and we'll start by understanding the cells that make up the message relay system in the nervous system. So we'll talk about the nervous tissues. But first, let's define neurology and a neurologist. Neurology deals with the normal functioning and disorders of the nervous system, while a neurologist is the person, a physician, the doctor, who diagnoses and treats disorders of the nervous system. And maybe some of you are planning in the future to become a neurologist. What are the structures of the nervous system? So it is composed of the brain, this one, neurons enclosed within the skull in your head. It is also composed of a spinal cord, this one. It connects the brain and enclosed within the spinal cavity. We've talked about the skeletal system, and you know for a fact that this spinal cord is located at the vertebral canal, made up of the vertebral foramen of the different vertebrae in our body. Of course, it is composed of nerves, bundles of many axons of neurons. The nervous system has 12 pairs of cranial nerves that emerge from the brain. The spinal nerves, 31 pairs, emerge from the spinal cord. And then the nervous system also has ganglia, a group of neurons, neuron cell bodies located outside of the brain and spinal cord. And it is also composed of enteric plexuses, different parts of the new nervous system that is located in our gastrointestinal tract. So these are networks in the digestive tract. And we'll talk also about sensory receptors that monitor changes in internal and external environments. These are all important for the sensing of the information inside and outside our body, the sending of the information to our central nervous system at the brain and spinal cord, and the different nerves that are involved in the motor or in the response with the interpretation of those information. Okay, so we have here the central nervous system. It is composed of the brain and spinal cord. And we'll talk about now the different divisions of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so we have a sensory division or afferent division with the letter A, because later we'll compare it with the motor division, or also termed as the efferent division. So sensory input here will be sent to the brain and spinal cord through the somatic senses and special senses. So sensory division, afferent division would be responsible for sending the information towards, okay, towards the brain and spinal cord through our somatic senses and special senses. In somatic senses, these include tactile, touch, thermal, that what's the temperature, pain, and proprioceptive sensations, what our body is uh, in position of, okay? What is the position of the body? Then special senses through its respective receptors, the smell, taste, vision, hearing, and the equilibrium. So the information that we have through our different senses will be sent towards the spinal cord and brain. And then later on, the central nervous system will interpret these sensations and will respond through the motor output, which is the motor will use the motor division or the efferent division. By the way, the sensory division and the motor division are both divisions under the peripheral nervous system. Okay, this is the nervous system outside the central nervous system. Okay, so in the peripheral nervous system, the efferent division, we have somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is the division or the system wherein we are in control of. We can control, thus it is voluntary, like controlling our skeletal muscles. When we want to walk, when we want to reach for something, when we want to eat, we use our skeletal muscles for movement. And also under for the motor output for the response, okay, the autonomic nervous system. This is a system that we are not in control of. Okay, so it responds, or there is an action automatically. Okay, so it has two main divisions: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, which has a role in the response through controlling the smooth muscles, the cardiac muscles, and the glands. Remember, we cannot control voluntarily our heart. Okay, so our heart, the digestion, the secretion of the glands, etc. And there's a separate or involuntary system under the autonomic nervous system, enteric nervous system, which actually has a role in controlling the smooth muscle and gland of the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, so it will detect how the intestines, small and large intestines, would get expanded, when is the need to contract those smooth muscles, when is the need to hasten or make the peristalsis, the movement of the contents of the intestine, faster. Okay, and when or when not to secrete the juices from the glands of the gastrointestinal tract. So sympathetic will talk, and parasympathetic will talk about these topics more in detail with our next topics, succeeding topics. Sympathetic is the flight or flight response. The parasympathetic is rest and digest, and then the enteric nervous system would be more of the gastrointestinal tract or the digestion that is included in our body. So what are the functions of the nervous system? The three main functions would be a sensory function, integrative function, and a motor function. Sensory function uses sensory receptors and sensory nerves, the afferent nerves. No? So as mentioned, they carry information into the brain and spinal cord through the cranial and spinal nerves. So for example, you see something that is, you see something that we want to eat, a food, for example. Maybe you're fond of making salads or cooking. So you see something and you want to cook something, and you see maybe the pan, or you see a pen that you want to reach for so that you could write. Okay, so these are different senses, sensory input, sensory information that would be sent towards the spinal cord and brain for interpretation. Okay, so that's the sensory function. Sense the different uh, senses: sight, touch, taste, etc. And then next function would be the integrative function. So the integration, the processing of information, the interpretation of the information sent from the sensory receptors. So there would be perception, which is the awareness of the sensory input. May pagkain sa lamesa. Nandyan yung, I'm aware that I'm in the office, or I'm at a room that there is a table, that the pen is there, the paper is prepared for me to write. Gaano kalayo, okay? And then analyzing and storing information to help lead to appropriate responses. Okay, so that's the second function. Integration happens in the central nervous system. And then appropriate response would be made through the motor function, the motor activity through our efferent nerves. So signals to the muscles and glands, or the effectors, would be activated. So this is the sequence of the flow of how the nervous system uh, interacts with all the structures that are needed from the sensing of the information towards the interpretation or integration of the information, and sending the appropriate response for the body. Whether do I need to chew the food, reach for the pen, right, etc. Okay, so example here in with Pikachu, like for example, the skin sense that there's fire, or that something is warm, or something is causing pain, and it will send signals towards the brain that, hey, there's pain at my tail. Okay, and then the brain would interpret it as there is fire, and the appropriate response is to really just move, okay, or stay away from the fire, or put the fire off. So that's sensing, interpreting the information, and responding through motor function. Okay, as mentioned, the organization of the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Now, the central nervous system is composed of the brain and spinal cord, the brain and the spinal cord, central nervous system, and the rest of the nervous system that is not included in the central nervous system is under the peripheral nervous system: the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, the enteric plexuses in small intestine and the different glands, and then the different receptors in our body. So again, aside, or all the structures that are not found in the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, the rest are included in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so all of these, the senses, the somatic and special senses for the afferent division, and the somatic nervous system, autonomic nervous system, all are part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so great. So, ayun. Hopefully, things are going pretty great as of this moment. And sabi ni Brain, Jeff, things are basically under control. Pero yun pala, maybe sometimes we tend to overthink and we want instant gratification. Yun. So, pang chill lang. Okay, let's proceed to the histology of the nervous system. The nervous system is composed of different neurons. This is really important, no? The nerve cells. They possess electrical excitability, the ability to respond to a stimulus and convert it to an action potential. The action potential is an electrical signal or nerve impulse that travels along neurons. Okay, we'll learn in a while that the action potential is like a message that needs to be sent from one point to another so that the information or the communication with the different structures would be continuous. From one point, from the hand, for example, from the tip of the finger towards the brain, action potential needs to be generated so that the information from touching a pin, for example, or my fire, for example, and then it's warm, it needs to, the action potential need or the message needs to be sent towards the brain. So dapat hindi siya ma-stop, no? So with the help of the neurons, it connects all regions of the body to the brain and spinal cord. So the action potential would be sent from one neuron to another, and we'll discuss it in more detail in a while. Okay, so the neurons are used for sensing. So sensing, ano yung taste, what do you see, what do you hear, what do you touch, no? Thinking, remembering, controlling muscle activity, and regulating glandular secretions. So all in all, these different functions are rules of the neurons. Okay, neuroglia cells support, nourish, and protect neurons. Okay, the neuroglia are critical for homeostasis of interstitial fluid around neurons. So these are not neurons, but they act as support cells of the neurons for nourishment of the neurons. So we have neurons and neuroglia cells. So let's start with the different parts of the neuron. Most neurons have three parts: a cell body, dendrites, and an axon. So this is a neuron. This is the cell body, the cell's life support center, and it has different branches of dendrites over here. Okay, the dendrites receive messages from other cells, and it has an axon. Okay, so the axon passes messages away from the cell body to other neurons. It could be passing an information towards a muscle or a gland. Okay, so dendrites receive information towards the cell body, and then axons will spread or relay the message from the body towards other glands and neurons or muscles. Okay, so for example, this is the information. It will be sensed by the dendrites. Then towards the cell body, and the uh, information will be sent along the axon towards other neurons, the muscle, or other glands. Okay, so let's talk about the cell body, this one. Okay, it is also termed as your perikaryon or soma. So it has a nucleus, cytoplasm with typical organelles including your lysosomes, mitochondria, Golgi complex. It also has three ribosomes and your rough endoplasmic reticulum, termed as your nuclear bodies. Okay, this one. And lipofuscin, okay, a yellowish brown granule in the cytoplasm, which is a product of neuronal lysosomes. Okay, that makes the cell body more of yellowish brown in color. Okay, ganglion are collections of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Okay, so they serve as release stations or distributing centers. And we'll talk about the ganglion when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, particularly under the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So this is the body of a neuron. A nerve fiber are neuronal processes that emerge from the cell body. So the cell body has nerve fibers. Okay, so most neurons have two kinds of processes. Yung nga, the multiple dendrites and the single axon, which are processes of the cell body. So the dendrites again receive the information, and the axon will be the one to send the information to other cells, like another neuron, the muscle cell, or a gland cell. Okay, so we have here dendrites. It's the meaning of dendrites is little trees. Okay, so if you look at them, they look like somehow little trees. Okay, they are the receiving portion or the input portion. They sense the information, and then they contain numerous receptor sites. This is important so as to be able to detect changes within the environment where the dendrites are located. They are highly branched structures that carry impulses to the cell body, okay, towards the cell body. And the cytoplasm contains nuclear bodies, mitochondria, and other organelles, as mentioned a while ago. Okay, so these are all dendrites, the receiving or input portion of the neuron, little trees. Okay, if the dendrites send the information towards the cell body, axons will relay the information from the cell body towards the what? Other cells, neuron, muscle, or gland cells. So conduct nerve impulses away from the cell body toward another neuron, muscle, or gland cell. Axon is a long, thin, cylindrical in projection. This one, axon, and emerges at a cone-shaped axon hillock. Okay, it's a small hill here. And there's what we call an initial segment, the axon part nearest to the axon hillock. Okay, initial segment. And the trigger zone is the where the nerve impulse arises. Okay, nerve impulse again would be the message that needs to be sent from one neuron to another. Okay, the message, the impulse. So the trigger zone is where the impulse arises, and it is located at the junction of the axon hillock and the initial segment. Okay, so the axon hillock and the initial segment. So the trigger zone would be located somehow here. Okay, the impulse arises here. between the axon hillock and the initial segment. There's what we call axoplasm. Okay, it's the axon cytoplasm. Okay, so here is an axon. So axoplasm is the axon cytoplasm inside, and an axolemma is the axon plasma membrane. One covers the axon. Okay, so those are the three parts of the neuron: dendrites, cell body, the axon. There's what we call axon terminal, the terminal part of one axon. Okay, these are fine processes at the end of the axon. Okay, at the end of the axon, it will have axon terminals. Okay, synaptic end bulbs and varicosities contain synaptic vesicles that can release neurotransmitters. Okay, so a bigger picture of the axon terminal and the synaptic end bulb would be this one. Mentioned that the synaptic end bulbs, this one, contain synaptic vesicles. When I say synaptic vesicles, you have to think about like packages. Okay, that these little circular ones. These are packages wherein neurotransmitters are stored. Okay, neurotransmitters, later on we'll learn that are information that is like also an information or the message that needs to be released, so that the message would be sent from one neuron to another. Okay, don't worry, we'll talk more about the role of neurotransmitters later on. So neurotransmitter, a molecule released from the synaptic vesicle. Again, the neurotransmitters are stored in synaptic vesicles at the end of the axon through the axon terminal and synaptic end bulb. And once these neurotransmitters are released in the synapse and interact with the receptors at the postsynaptic neuron or the neuron next to the axon terminal, okay, it either excites or inhibits an action. It depends on what type of neurotransmitter and what type of receptor is it activating. Okay, so in short, for this slide, axon terminal, the terminal part, the end part of an axon where there is an synaptic end bulb. At the bulb, there would be packages called your synaptic vesicles, no? Circular vesicles, wherein anong nasa loob ng vesicles? Neurotransmitters. And for the information and for the information that needs to be uh, sent from one neuron to another, these neurotransmitters need to be released to either activate, excite, or inhibit a particular action. It depends on what type of neurotransmitter is stored here and what type of uh, neuro, of receptors are located in your postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so we're done with the basic parts of a neuron. Now we'll need to classify the neurons according to the structure and according to its function. So we have two main classifications of neurons. Structural classification depends on its structure, uh, its components, and the second classification would depend on what's its function. Let's start with the structural classes of neurons. So structurally, neurons are classified according to the number of processes extending from the cell body. No? So the number of processes. So we have three main structural classes with regard to its number, no? Number of the processes muna. Multipolar neurons have several or many dendrites and one axon. So this is an example of a multipolar neuron. No? The cell body with the dendrites, the axon terminal. Ano yung multipolar? Several, maraming dendrites, as you could see here, and one axon. So this is the most common type of neuron that is found in the brain and the spinal cord. Okay. So the second classification would be a bipolar neuron. Pi, dalawa, have one dendrite and one axon. At one point, merong isang dendrite, no? Isa lang as compared to this one, marami sa multipolar. Bipolar, one dendrite and one axon. So examples of bipolar neurons are found in the retina of the eye, receptor for vision, nasa likod ng mga eyes natin, the inner ear, and the olfactory area of the brain. No? Olfaction is the sense of smell, no? Olfactory area of the brain. No? So the third type would be unipolar, have fused dendrite and axon that emerges from the body. No? So fused ang dendrite natin and the axon. No? Fused, isa, kaya siya unipolar. So sensory neurons of spinal and cranial nerves are examples of unipolar neurons. No? Nasa spinal and cranial nerves, which are sensory neurons. No? Actually, the more appropriate term for the unipolar neurons would be pseudo-unipolar neurons. Pseudo lang. Parang atik-atik, hindi totoo na unipolar. Because the reason behind is in the embryo, no, immature pa, the unipolar start as bipolar neurons, this one. But along the course of the development, the dendrite and the axon fuse together, not fuse together, and they emerge from the cell body. So they become a unipolar neuron. Ayun. So this is a multipolar neuron, maraming dendrites. You have a bipolar, one dendrite, one axon, and unipolar. The axon and the dendrite are fused together. Just another picture. Unipolar, fused together an axon and dendrite or an axon to another axon. Bipolar, one axon and one dendrite. And in multipolar neuron, maraming dendrites. No? So some neurons are named for the histologists who first described them, like your Purkinje cells. And some are named according to their shape or appearance. So Purkinje cells, which are rich in the cerebellum part of our brain, cerebellar part, they are arranged like dominoes, no? Ayan, like dominoes, rich in, there's really a particular arrangement, no? Arrangement of the dendrites. And then the pyramidal cell, which are rich in the cerebral cortex, they look like a pyramid. No? So the arrows are the direction of the impulses. No? From the dendrites to the cell body, then towards the axon and axon terminal. Example of pyramidal cell in the cerebral cortex, and this one in Purkinje cells in the cerebellum. Okay, so we'll proceed with the functional classification of the neurons. What's their function? Okay, so functionally, neurons are classified according to the direction in which the nerve impulse or action potential, the message, no? The message is conveyed with respect to the central nervous system. Ano yung direction niya? From what point to, what point? No? From what particular structure to what structure is the message sent? No? So let's start with the sensory or afferent neurons. So they convey impulses into the central nervous system, the brain, or spinal cord. So either contain sensory receptors at their distal ends, the dendrites, okay, or are located just after sensory receptors that are separate cells, malapit lang sa sensory afferent neurons natin. Okay? So, here. So, once an appropriate stimulus activates a sensory receptor, this one, the dendrites, the sensory neuron forms an action potential in its axon, and the action potential is conveyed into the central nervous system through the cranial spinal nerves. And sensory or afferent neurons are usually unipolar in structure. Okay, so here in this picture, this side is peripheral nervous system. This side is the central nervous system. No, so the information, no, the information is detected by the sensory receptor, the dendrites. No, then the nerve impulse will be sent towards the axon. Okay, this is an example of a ganglion. No, cell body outside the central nervous system. So the sensory neuron, ang direction is from the peripheral nervous system. It sends the information and send it to the central nervous system. Yun nga, Pikachu ulit. Uy, mainit. Send niya. May mainit akong nararamdaman sa tail ko. Yun na part, sensory or afferent neuron. Second functional class is your interneurons or the association neurons, mainly located within the central nervous system between the sensory and motor neurons. Interneurons integrate, process incoming sensory information from sensory neurons and then elicit a motor response by activating the appropriate motor neurons, no? So interneurons sila yung nag-iisip, nag-i-interpret, no? The process. Ano yung information na send? So from nerve impulse from the sensory neuron towards the interneuron, no? Ito na yung interneuron. Siya na yung mag-i-interpret. Once the message is received here, the interneuron will interpret, open a message, no? Uy, may mainit sa tail. Okay? So it needs to give a response by activating the motor neurons. Uy, kailangan mong mag-move. Okay? You need to move and stay away from the fire. Okay? So the third type of the under the functional classes of the neurons would be your motor efferent neurons. They convey action potentials away from the central nervous system, from this one, away from the central nervous system towards the effectors, the muscle and the glands in the peripheral nervous system through the cranial and spinal nerves again. So motor neurons are multipolar in structure. Okay, so sensory, interneuron usually sensory usually unipolar, and interneuron and the motor neuron usually multipolar neurons. No? So this is the flow of the nerve impulse. You sense first, then it will be processed and interpreted, and the brain will tell you what to do, what's your response, no, through the motor neuron. Sensory, interneuron, motor. Okay, let's proceed with the neuroglia. Okay, as mentioned, neuroglia are not neurons. They are different cells from the neurons. Okay, these are cells that are smaller compared to your neurons, but are 5 to 25 times more numerous than your neurons. Mas marami sila. No? So these are different neuroglia surrounding your neuron. No? So these are neuroglial cells. They can multiply and divide and fill in brain areas. And we term brain tumors that are derived or come from neuroglia as gliomas. No? Tumor coming from the neuroglia. So what's the function of your neuroglia again? No, bakit sila present dyan? They do not generate or propagate action potentials like your neurons, no, propagate or send the information like your neurons, but they do support, nourish, and protect your neurons. No, support, nourish, and protect your neurons. No, so this is a glioma over here. So there are 6 types of neuroglia. 6 types of cells that support, nourish, and protect your neurons. No? So some neuroglia are found in the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, but some are present also in the peripheral nervous system. 4 types are found in the central nervous system. What are these? Astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglia, and your ependymal cells. Okay, so I want you to appreciate their characteristic appearance, no? And 2 types are also located in the peripheral nervous system. Satellite cells, this one, and your Schwann cells, this one. Parang nag-envelope siya sa axon, no? Oligodendrocyte here. Okay, so again, central nervous system, you have your astrocytes that are interacting with a capillary, no, blood vessel. Microglia, you have your ependymal cells with cilia, oligodendrocytes, no, covering for your axon. Then peripheral nervous system, you have your Schwann cells and your satellite cells over here. Apat, dalawa. Okay, so we'll discuss one by one the different types of neuroglia. No? Let's start with your astrocytes. Astro means star. No wonder that the appearance of astrocytes looks like star, parang star sila. No? Astrocyte, parang star. They have many processes, madaming finger-like projections. It's the largest and most numerous of the neuroglia, and the processes of astrocytes make contact with blood capillaries, neurons, and the pia mater. No? They make contact closely associated to blood vessels. Yeah, blood vessel. Closely have in contact with neurons, ibang neurons, and the pia mater. The pia mater is one of the meninges. When you say meninges, it's a layer of covering for the central nervous system for protection, no? Not included really right now, but I would just like to mention the three meninges that cover the central nervous system, that cover the brain and the spinal cord. You have a dura mater, from outside to inside, dura mater. So these are three layers: dura, arachnoid, and pia mater. Dura, arachnoid, and pia, the AP. Okay, dura would be dense. Then next would be arachnoid, more more friable than the dura mater, and the pia mater would be the one really having close intact with the brain and spinal cord. Okay, so we have two types of astrocytes: protoplasmic astrocytes and the fibrous astrocytes. Protoplasmic astrocytes have many short branching processes and are found in gray matter. We'll talk about the gray matter in a while your fibrous astrocytes have many long unbranched processes and are located mainly in white matter. Okay, because your brain and your spinal cord will have both white matter and gray matter. Okay, so these are your astrocytes. So here, this would be your pia matter. Okay, one of the three layers. So if this is the pia matter, okay, this would be your ventricle. The ventricles are cavities in the brain that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, but we'll talk about it in a while. So I just want to show you the protoplasmic astrocyte here that will have an interaction with near the near other cells, and fibrous astrocytes also. No, astrocytes will have association with the blood vessel. No? Red blood cell located here. The neuroglia of the central nervous system are distinguished on the basis of the size, the cytoplasmic processes, and the intracellular organization. In short, the neuroglia, the different types, will have their corresponding characteristics that make them different from other neuroglia. Okay, let's proceed with the second type of neuroglia, the oligodendrocytes. No? Oligo means few, dendro means tree. So like few tree projections. No? So your oligodendrocytes resemble astrocytes, mukhang astrocytes, but are smaller and contain fewer processes. No? Few tree-like processes. No? And the processes of the oligodendrocytes form myelin sheaths around the central nervous system axons. No? Later, we'll learn that the myelin sheath is important for the conduction of the message, which is the action potential. No? So myelin sheath, galing siya sa processes ng oligodendrocyte. Ano tong myelin sheath? Myelin sheath is a multi-layered lipid and protein covering around some axons that insulates them and increases the speed of nerve impulse conduction. So it's important for the rate, the speed of the propagation, the spread of the nerve impulse, or the spreading of the message, no, when there is myelin sheath, no. So oligodendrocyte and then its processes, no, will cover the appropriate axons forming the myelin sheath. So you could see here, multi-layered yung myelin sheath natin. Okay, so here would be your oligodendrocytes. No, they have fewer processes, and their processes, no, their projections will have appropriate connections with the axon and cover it, making it myelinated. No, may myelin sheath siya. Kung may myelin sheath, faster ang spread ng message, faster ang spread ng action potential. Oligodendrocyte, ayun. Process niya will cover an axon. So this one, this axon and this one, no, would be termed as myelinated because of the myelin sheath from the processes of the oligodendrocyte. Okay, third type of neuroglia would be your microglia or your microglial cells. No? Microglia or microglial cells. Micro means small, so maliliit tong cells na ito. Small cells with slender processes that give off numerous spine-like projections, and they function as phagocytes. No? They eat, no? They eat or engulf microbes or damage nervous tissue. So like tissue macrophages, they remove the microglia, remove cellular debris formed during normal development of the nervous system, and phagocytize microbes and damaged nervous tissue. So these are your microglial cells, no, located in the central nervous system in the brain. They look like this, maliliit to sila, but they have slender projections, konti lang, as seen here, no? Smaller as compared to your astrocytes and oligodendrocytes, no? And they have a phagocytic characteristic. They eat or phagocytize microbes and damage nervous tissue. Okay, and then we'll talk about the ependymal cells. Ependymal cells, cuboidal or columnar cells arranged in a single layer that possess microvilli and cilia. Okay, so these are ependymal cells, cuboidal or columnar cells, ayan, arranged in a single layer, isang layer lang yan sila. And anong meron sila? They have microvilli and cilia. Okay, so like really tiny finger-like projections. No? Here, ependymal cells, ayun, meron pa rin silang microvilli and cilia. These cells line the ventricles of the brain and the central canal of the spinal cord, which are spaces filled with CSF, as mentioned a while ago. Yung ventricles are spaces or cavities in our brain that is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This cerebrospinal fluid protects and nourishes the brain and spinal cord. So ependymal cells are really important. No? They produce, possibly monitor, and assist in the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. No? So they form also the blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier so that the it separates, no, the blood component or the capillary from the cerebrospinal fluid. You know, ependymal cells here. Ependymal cells. So they help in the production of the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, So we're done with the neuroglia found in the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. Now we'll discuss the two neuroglia found in the peripheral nervous system, which are your Schwann cells and your satellite cells. Neuroglia of the peripheral nervous system completely surround axons and cell bodies. Completely surround axons and cell bodies. So the two types again would be your Schwann cells and the satellite cells. No? So you could see here Schwann cells also have a role in making the axon in the peripheral nervous system myelinated, no? Like your oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system, di ba? And ayun, satellite cells also. Okay? Discuss more specifically about Schwann cells. Schwann cells encircle the peripheral nervous system axons. Like oligodendrocytes, as mentioned, they form the myelin sheath around axons. So they form myelin sheath. A single oligodendrocyte myelinates several axons, as you saw a while ago. One oligodendrocyte with its different projections, pwede niyang mag-make ng myelin sheath with different axons. However, in each Schwann cell sa peripheral nervous system, it only myelinates a single axon. No? Isa lang. So, one Schwann cell, one axon to myelinate sa peripheral nervous system. As compared to your oligodendrocytes, with its different projections, marami siyang na gagawan ng myelin sheath. Madaming axons. Okay? Or at different sites in an axon. A single Schwann cell can also enclose as many as 20 or more unmyelinated axons. No? Axons that lack a myelin sheath. No? Pwedeng more than one, but these axons are not myelinated. No? Walang myelin sheath. Okay? Unmyelinated axons are axons that lack myelin sheath. Just like this one. Walang myelin sheath. Wala nito. Okay? Unmyelinated. As many as 20 or more unmyelinated axons ang pwedeng ma-enclose or cover ng Schwann cells. The Schwann cells participate in axon regeneration, which is more easily accomplished in the peripheral nervous system than in the central nervous system. Because Schwann cells nga participate in axon regeneration. Once there is damage in the neurons in the axons, the regeneration is better in the peripheral nervous system because meron ng Schwann cells to help in the regeneration as compared to your central nervous system. Okay. Myelinated and unmyelinated axons, comparing them, no? Myelinated, unmyelinated. Notice that one layer of Schwann cell plasma membrane surrounds unmyelinated axons. Isa lang pero maraming axons sa unmyelinated. No? So here resembles a Schwann cell, no? Enclosing an axon and making the myelin sheath. No? The Schwann cell, ikot siya until such time that it makes up the myelin sheath for the axon, making the axon myelinated. Okay? So this is an unmyelinated axon. Bakit ko nilagay itong SOS? Na? SOS. Because I want you to remember na axons surrounded by a myelin sheath produced either by Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system or by oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system are said to be myelinated. So these cells make the neuron or the axon myelinated. Ang difference lang nila, oligodendrocytes are found in the central nervous system. The Schwann cells are found in the peripheral nervous system, but both oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells play a role in making myelin sheath for the axons, no? So difference. SOS, bakit SOS? Kasi oligodendrocyte nasa central nervous system. Schwann cells would be at the peripheral nervous system. Just to remember, okay? A mnemonic to remember: Schwann cells, peripheral nervous system, oligodendrocytes at the central nervous system, SOS, that play a part in myelinating the axons in both the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Okay. Now we'll proceed with the satellite cells. No? These are lot cells that surround the cell bodies of neurons of the peripheral nervous system ganglia. Remember ganglia? These are cell bodies that are found outside the central nervous system. So they are covered by satellite cells. What do? They provide structural support and they regulate the exchanges of materials between neuronal cell bodies and interstitial fluid. So here in this picture, almost the same lang sila. No? Schwann cells here, because both are located at the peripheral nervous system, no? Help in the myelinating the axon. One Schwann cell, one axon. Satellite cells cover niya yung ganglion, no? For structural support and exchange of nutrients and materials between the neuronal cell bodies and the interstitial fluid. Okay. We talked about the myelination, no? Axons covered with a myelin sheath are termed to be myelinated neurons or myelinated axons, no? So many layers of lipid and protein insulates the neurons, no? Insulates the neurons, and it also increases the speed of nerve conduction. Mas mabilis yung nerve conduction, mas mabilis yung relay ng message. They appear in white, so in white matter, and the neuroglia producing myelin sheaths include your SOS, oligodendrocytes at the central nervous system, Schwann cells at the peripheral nervous system. Neurolema, outer nucleated cytoplasmic layer of the Schwann cell. Neurolema, this one is a neurolema, no? Outer nucleated cytoplasmic layer encloses the myelin sheath. Encloses the myelin sheath. It aids in axon regeneration. That's the reason why Schwann cells nga help in the repair or the restoration of an axon once there is an injury. No? There's also what we call nodes of Ranvier. These are gaps in the myelin, no? May gaps in the myelin sheath. No, merong area na wala yung hindi covered yung axon with myelin sheath. We call it nodes of Ranvier. Nodes are important for rapid signal conduction. So, mas mabilis ang conduction also with the nodes of, dahil myelinated to, no? Later we'll learn that with the nodes of Ranvier, the action potential will not just course like in a straight line, but palukso-lukso through the nodes of Ranvier lang yung action potential. That's the reason why the conduction is faster in myelinated axons. Okay, we'll talk about that in more detail later. And then some diseases that destroy myelin would include your multiple sclerosis and your Tay-Sachs disease. comparing your myelinated and your unmyelinated axons, no? So this is myelinated. May covering siya, myelin sheath. And this one is a unmyelinated axon. Schwann cell, maraming unmyelinated axons ang pwede niyang i-cover once it is unmyelinated. Here is your neurolima here. Helps in the restoration of an axon once the axon is injured. Multiple sclerosis, it's an autonomic disease. The immune system attacks itself, causing the demyelination of the myelin sheath. So the nerve affected by the multiple sclerosis. As mentioned, once the axon or the neuron is myelinated, mas mabilis or faster yung spread ng action potential or the message. So if there is damage in the myelinated portions, then the action potential will also be slow or totally, kung ang injury is severe, yung action potential or the information will not reach its destination. So what happens in multiple sclerosis? It's an immune-mediated inflammatory demyelinating disease of the central nervous system. What does it mean? Immune-mediated, the immune system attacks the myelin sheath, and causing demyelination. Nasisira ngayong myelin sheath, Ano yung iba't ibang signs and symptoms that the patient experiences, like clumsiness or muscle weakness. Bakit? Kasi nga yung action potential hindi siya sustained, because the myelin sheath now are destroyed. Kaya clumsy, nahuhulog yung hinahawakan, na bumabangga kasi hindi na coordinated yung movement, Paresthesias are felt, like feeling of pricking of needles, and then there is this Lermite sign, like parang flow of electrical shock from the neck towards the back, so, and optic neuritis. So multiple sclerosis affects the myelin sheath, and the effect nga, because myelin sheath helps in the propagation or spread of the message. Dahil sira na yun, hindi na maayos yung pag-spread ng message, the action potential. Kaya nagiging clumsy kasi hindi na coordinated yung movement natin. In Tay-Sachs disease, both parents carry the Tay-Sachs gene, and their baby or offspring will manifest the different signs and symptoms. In Tay-Sachs disease, the problem is there is build-up of a fatty component because the body in Tay-Sachs disease does not have an enzyme that will break down that fatty component. So the fatty component will build up in the nervous system, central nervous system in particular, and it will also affect the myelin. So the patient will have progressive neurodegeneration, but during delivery, somehow the baby looks like normal, but symptoms by age 6 months appear. So there will be deterioration in the motor, mental, and the vision. So there will be a spot on the macula that will tell us during fundoscopy, using the ophthalmoscope or fundoscope, check natin ang mata, that the patient could probably lead to progressive blindness. Tapos sensitive din through hearing. All of these are because of a problem with still the neurons, the myelin sheath of the neurons. So let's try to review some terms, a collection of nervous tissue. So a cluster of neuron cell bodies ha, yung mga bodies. Ganglion is the term that we use of cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, but we call it nucleus or nuclei, cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system. Bundles of axons na, we term it as nerve, bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system, and call the bundles of axons tract when they are in the central nervous system. So same lang, cell bodies and axons, but they are named differently. They are named differently comparing when they are found in the peripheral nervous system and central nervous system. Okay. Okay. So let's discuss about the gray and white matter. Okay, so white matter primarily are myelinated axons. No? Myelinated, may myelin sheath. And gray matter are composed of cell bodies, the dendrites, and myelinated axons, axon terminus, and neuroglia. Okay, these cells that support the neurons. So, what are the locations of the gray and white matter? So you would see here in the spinal cord here about the distribution of the gray and white matter. White matter, or termed as tracts, because it's located in the central nervous system, the tracts surround centrally located gray matter, and then they shape it like an H or a butterfly. No, the white matter, the tracts, no, surround the centrally located gray matter, resembling a letter H or a butterfly. As compared to the brain, the gray matter in thin cortex surrounds white matter or tracts. No? So, sa spinal cord, nasa labas yung puti. Sa brain, nasa loob yung puti. Okay? White matter, which are myelinated axons. Okay? So here, the gray matter, the H, white matter, and here, gray matter, nasa labas ng cortex natin. Okay. The neuron regeneration. So regeneration of the peripheral nervous system neurons, axons and dendrite in the peripheral nervous system can be repaired if cell body is intact and Schwann cells functional. As mentioned, Schwann cells play an important role in the regeneration. No? And these form a regeneration tube and grow axons or dendrites if scar tissue does not fill the tube. Okay. As compared to the regeneration of the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, very limited, even if cell body is intact, because it is inhibited by the neuroglia and by lack of fetal growth stimulators. Okay, so it's more complicated in cases when we entertain patients who come for consultation when the central nervous system is already affected. No? So brain and spinal cord, mas mahirap siya i-manage and the rehabilitation would be more difficult because nga limited ang regeneration of the central nervous system neurons. Okay, break time. Sige, appreciate the picture. We feel blessed or lucky na nakalagay dyan kung may nagkikare sa atin. Di ba? Okay. Ayun. Para interactive sa YouTube. Comment down below if you are lucky or not, or if you are blessed. Sino yung reason why do you think you are blessed, or why do you think uh, you're happy? Di ba? Para interactive. Kunyari. Okay, let's proceed. So now we'll talk about the electrical signals in neurons. The message that needs to be spread or to be sent, no? So that there would be uh, analysis sa brain, no? And pabalik, ano yung message from the brain to the motor, no? Sensory to the interneuron to the motor. May message. So this, in sending the messages, we have to know what are these electrical signals. So again, neurons are electrically excitable. They communicate with one another using two types of electrical signals. First would be your graded potentials, and second would be your action potentials. No? Graded and action potentials. The graded potentials are used for short distance communication only, short lang, because eventually these graded potentials die out, no? Parang few distance lang ang inaabot nila. As compared to your action potentials, they allow communication over long distance within the body. No? Nerve action potential or nerve impulse, action potential that occurs in a neuron or nerve cell. So we call it these different potentials, graded and action potentials, which are both nerve action potentials or nerve impulse. Okay, so let's have an overview of the nervous system function. No, how, yun nga sabi ko nga, from sensory to interneuron to motor neuron. Okay, so let's get oriented with the picture first before we discuss about the different steps how the impulse start or how is it being spread. So graded potentials and nerve and muscle action potentials are involved in the relay of sensory stimuli, integrative functions such as perception and motor activities. So you would be able to observe here na nandito na yung three functions: the sensory stimuli, sensory function; integrative, integration; there is perception; and then motor function. No? Ganun yung system natin. Ganun yung the flow of the activity for the action. No? May sense, may pag-iisip, integration, and then there would be response through motor. Ayan. So here, this person wants to write something, a love letter, using a pen sa paper. So first, as you touch the pen, a graded potential develops in a sensory receptor in the skin of the fingers. So there is a graded potential na nade-develop through the sensory receptor na nakita ko yung pen, nafe-feel ko ang pen. So we'll focus on the touching of the pen first, okay? So here are the legends. Yung key. Graded potential, the blue, black, nerve action potential, and the yellow would be the muscle action potential. Okay, so it starts here, na-touch yung pen. So sensory receptor activated and a graded potential develops. No? Blue, graded potential. Ano yung graded potential again? electrical impulse that just courses short lang yung distance niya, no? The graded potential triggers the axon of the sensory neuron to form a nerve action potential, no? The graded potential here will trigger a nerve action potential, which is the action potential, the message that could be relayed in a longer distance as compared to the graded potential, di ba? So the graded potential triggers the axon of the sensory neuron to form a nerve action potential which travels along the axon into the central nervous system and ultimately causes the release of neurotransmitter at a synapse with an interneuron. No? So from sensory to interneuron na tayo, which plays a part in the integration, ang interneuron. No? So focus on the picture. From here, graded potential activates or triggers the axon ng sensory neuron, a nerve action potential. So the nerve action potential will continue until such time it could reach the central nervous system. Central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. No? Punta na dito sensory. No? Dito sa likod, no? Posterior. Because your spinal nerve, this one, is composed of a sensory and a motor nerve. No? Sensory nerve is located posteriorly, while your motor nerve is located anteriorly. No? So, sensory muna tayo. The information needs to be sent towards the central nervous system. No? So, towards the posterior sensory nerve until such time nga it will release a neurotransmitter at a synapse with a interneuron. No? Yun, may release na ng neurotransmitter. Release of the neurotransmitter, the component, also a message that is stored in a synaptic vesicle, the circles a while ago. No? Yung message na yun, nasi-spread, sent towards the interneuron. Okay? So, axonal terminals here, axon terminal, yung bulb, wherein nandun yung synaptic vesicle where the neurotransmitters are released. So, eventually, it activates the interneuron. Now here, the neurotransmitter stimulates the interneuron to form a graded potential in its dendrites and cell body. No? So from graded potential, action potential, neurotransmitter, again dito, neurotransmitter, again, graded potential na naman. No? Short course na naman. Graded potential. In response to the graded potential, the axon of the interneuron forms a nerve action potential na naman. No? So, ang nagti-trigger for the action potential is your graded potential. Graded action potential. Neurotransmitter, graded action potential. Later, ano na naman? Graded, then action potential. So this process of neurotransmitter release at a synapse followed by the formation of a graded potential and then a nerve action potential occurs over and over as interneurons in higher parts of the brain, such as the thalamus and cerebral cortex, are activated until such time ma-activate na yung thalamus and cerebral cortex. For this matter, for the perception, cerebral cortex ang kailangan ma-activate. So, successive yung merong graded potential, activates the action potential, Then there would be release of neurotransmitter, then graded potential again, action potential, neurotransmitter graded potential, action potential within the interneurons. No? So perception is the conscious awareness of a sensation that is primarily a function of the cerebral cortex. Kaya yung sa picture, cerebral cortex. Perception, conscious awareness of sensation, you know that you're touching the pen, sorry. You know that you're touching the pen. So suppose that you want to use the pen to write a letter, the nervous system would respond in the following way. So from the sensory, blue, then interneuron, I don't know what color is this, violet, I don't know. This one, the interneuron. And then now, if you want to respond, that you want to write a letter, no? Write a letter. So response through the motor neuron na tayo, red. Okay. A stimulus in the brain causes a graded potential. This one, may graded potential dito. To form in the dendrites and cell body of an upper motor neuron. An upper motor neuron, which is a type of motor neuron that synapses with a lower motor neuron farther down in the central nervous system in order to contract a skeletal muscle. In short, graded. So upper motor neuron will interact with a lower motor neuron here, no? So that the graded action potential triggers another action potential. Graded potential activates an action potential from the upper motor neuron towards the, yun, may graded potential, then action potential until such time it will interact with a lower motor neuron. No? So the graded potential subsequently causes a nerve action potential, no, to occur in the axon of the upper motor neuron, followed by the neurotransmitter release. Okay. Then eventually, the neurotransmitter generates a graded potential in a lower motor neuron. Here, a graded potential in the lower motor neuron, which is a type of motor neuron that directly supplies the skeletal muscle fibers. No? Associated na siya sa skeletal muscle fibers. The graded potential triggers the formation of a nerve action potential again, and then release of the neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction formed with skeletal muscle fibers that control movement of the fingers. So eventually there would be release, or there would be a muscle action potential na to control the fingers that that control the fingers and the hand for writing. Okay? So, ganun. So, the neurotransmitter stimulates the muscle fibers that control the finger movement to form muscle action potential. The muscle action potentials cause these muscle fibers to contract, which allows you to write now with the pen. Okay. So, ayun. So, ganun yung sequence, no? Sensory, interneuron integration, then motor neuron, no? Motor function. Starts with a graded potential. Na-feel niya yung pen. Then there would be, it will trigger an action potential, nerve action potential until it reaches the central nervous system, no? Until such time, there would be release of neurotransmitter from the sensory neuron to the interneuron to activate a graded potential, then another action potential, release of neurotransmitter, then graded potential until it reaches the part ng brain that needs to be activated, and then there would be integration. Then ano yung response natin? So upper motor neuron would So there would be graded potential activation again here. Then it will trigger again an action. Graded potential, then it will trigger an action potential. Until such time, the upper motor neuron will release neurotransmitter to activate again the lower motor neuron and activate a graded potential. Then it will trigger again a nerve action potential, no? Until such time that it will have the lower motor neuron uh, will have an effect in the neuromuscular junction, no? So to have a muscle action potential for the contraction of the muscles needed for writing. Ayun. So again, lalabas ko si Pikachu kasi so that you could remember. No? Sensory, then integration, and then motor. Okay? So this is an overview of the nervous system function. Okay. So let's compare graded and action potentials. The production of graded potentials and action potentials depend on two basic features of the plasma membrane of excitable cells. No, so there would be production of graded and action potentials because of the existence of the resting membrane potential, merong resting membrane potential, and the presence of specific types of ion channels, which you know for a fact, marami, no, distributed along the membrane. So a membrane potential is an electrical potential termed as voltage, no, electrical potential difference across cell membrane. Voltage is the term, no, as the termed as the resting membrane potential voltage. So it's the difference between the positive and the negativity outside and inside the cell. Resting membrane potential, voltage. Ion channels allow ions to move by diffusion from high to low concentration. So leakage channels allow ions to leak through the membrane, and there are more potassium than for sodium leak channels. And gated channels, open and close on command, respond to changes in the membrane, so can generate and conduct action potentials also. We would be able to understand this more with pictures. Okay. Sige, appreciate muna the pictures. Okay. Ion channels in the plasma membrane. When ion channels are open, they allow specific ions to move across the plasma membrane down their electrochemical gradient. So a concentration or chemical difference plus an electrical difference. The concentration or the chemical difference is yun nga, from higher to lower concentration. No? Pwedeng diffusion or higher to lower concentration. Kung saan siya mas marami, pupunta siya sa mas konti. The electrical difference is positively charged ions will be drawn to or attracted to negatively charged areas. Having said that, negatively charged ions will be attracted towards the positively charged areas. Okay, so your concentration or the chemical difference would be the higher to lower. Electrical would be yun nga, opposite charges attract. So, ayun. Yun yung sabi ko. So as ions move, they create a flow of electrical current that can change the membrane potential. Okay, it can change the membrane potential. So let's get oriented with the picture first. This one is the extracellular fluid. This is the plasma membrane. You have here the channel or the gate. This is the cytosol. So outside the membrane, inside the cell. Okay. So this is potassium leak channel that is closed. No? Closed yung potassium leak channel. So the channel randomly opens and closes. So once it opens, there would be leaking of the potassium from inside to outside, from the cytosol towards the extracellular fluid. No? So if this happens, what is the effect? No? Potassium is positively charged. So from positive inside, it goes outside because potassium is more abundant intracellularly. No? Intracellularly. So from higher to lower concentration, potassium will leak outwards. No? So once potassium leaves the cell, no, it makes the intracellular charge more negative kasi nawalan ka ng positive eh. No? So second picture, ligand-gated channel. Here, the ligand-gated channel is closed. No? So you have here calcium, sodium, and potassium. And then you have here your acetylcholine. So your acetylcholine is a chemical stimulus that opens the channel. So once the ligand-gated channel opens, no, so there would be potassium will flow outside, but your sodium will flow inside, no, and your calcium ions as well. So that's your ligand-gated channel. Chemical stimulus, acetylcholine is needed for the ligand-gated channel to open. Next is mechanically gated channel. So there should be a mechanical stimulus like pressure. No, may pressure, mechanical stimulus. So here, closed siya, yung mechanically gated channel. Once there is a mechanical stimulus, the channel opens. So papasok yung calcium and sodium natin. Okay? And then there's what we call voltage-gated channels. Voltage-gated channels, they open or close depending on the voltage. Okay? Depending on the voltage. Ano yung electrical charge, the voltage? No. So here, voltage-gated potassium channel closed. And then change in the membrane potential opens the channel. So here from -70 to -50, no? So meaning the intracellular charge became more or less negative, no? Naging -50 na lang. Maybe because yun nga, because of the potassium leakage, for example. So for example, may potassium leakage kayo dito sa side. That made the intracellular voltage less negative. And because of the change in the voltage, the potassium channel opened. Okay, leading to more negativity. Ayan. So these are the different ion channels in the plasma membrane. Pwedeng leak, random lang, ligand-gated, mechanically gated by pressure, for example, then voltage gated channels. Okay, let's talk about this resting membrane potential, the voltage. Okay, typically the resting membrane potential is around negative 70 millivolts. No, negative 70 millivolts. Inside of membrane, more negative than the outside. No? Kaya siya negative 70. Inside of the membrane is more negative than the outside. Caused by presence of ions. Inside is more negative because cytosol has the following. Many negative ions, too large to leak out, amino acids in cellular proteins, and phosphates as in the adenosine triphosphate. No, negative. Kaya, and then potassium that easily leaks out through many potassium channels as mentioned. No? Kaya, ang inside more negative. Outside more positive because extracellular fluid has few negative ions. Sodium that does not leak out of cell because you only have few sodium channels, but meron ding sodium channels nagli-leak, no? And then you have membrane pumps that quickly pump out sodium that does leak or diffuse into cell. Okay. The resting membrane potential is an electrical potential difference or voltage that exists across the plasma membrane of an excitable cell under resting conditions. Okay, let's get oriented. This is extracellular fluid, the plasma membrane, and the cytosol. Here, more or less, you have equal numbers of positive and negative charges in most of the extracellular fluid. Here in the cytosol, you have equal numbers of positive and negative charges in most of cytosol. No? And then the resting membrane potential, an electrical potential difference across the plasma membrane. So this is the distribution of charges that produce the resting membrane potential of a neuron. No? More or less equal ang charges nila dito and as compared to dito. However, when we compare the extracellular fluid and the cytosol, no, by using the recording microelectrode, the tip is inserted inside the cell, and then we also have a reference electrode out at the extracellular fluid, and both are connected to a voltmeter which measures the voltage. And by measuring the resting membrane potential, again, it is found out that the inside, inside, because the electrodes measure the like the electrical impulse, more positive bomb or negative, and it shows that the resting membrane potential is at negative 70 millivolts, more negative ang inside. Okay. That's the average or typical resting membrane potential, negative 70 millivolts ang voltage niya. So what are the three factors that contribute to the resting membrane potential? What are these three factors? The resting membrane potential is determined by three major factors. First is unequal distribution of ions in the extracellular fluid and cytosol. As mentioned, different ang ions natin extracellular fluid and in the cytosol. First, because nga more ang potassium leak channels natin as compared to your sodium leak channel. No? So, more potassium leaks outside, making the inside more negative kasi positive yung lumalabas. There are sodium leak channels, so sodium leaks inside. However, sodium leaks inside. However, mas maraming lumalabas na potassium as compared to your sodium, although both are positively charged. Okay? That still ends up making the inside more negative. Second, inability of most anions to leave the cell. Yun nga, as mentioned, the phosphate in adenosine triphosphate and large proteins which are negatively charged, they have the inability to leave the cell. Hindi sila nakakalabas kasi nga malaki and non-diffusible ang molecules that they are associated with. Hindi makalabas. So, nasa loob lang sila, negative. Which adds to the reason why the inside is more negative. And the third determining factor would be the electrogenic nature of these sodium potassium ATPases. This one. Okay, so in exchange of, it pumps out 3 sodium ions in exchange of 2 potassium ions inside. Okay, with the use of ATP. So sodium potassium ATPase. So tatlong ions outside as compared to 2 ions inside. No? Ayun. So more negative ulit ang inside. No? So these factors help us understand why the electrical charge inside is more negative as compared to the charge outside at the extracellular fluid. Okay? 3 na out. 2K in. I'm thinking about a mnemonic that you could remember. Maybe you could think about a girl na si Trina lumabas sa bahay ni Kuya. And then binigyan siya ng 2K inside. I don't know. You think about the mnemonics that you should remember. 3 na out, 2K in. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the graded potential. Yun nga, di ba? A graded potential is a small deviation from the resting membrane potential that makes the membrane either more polarized or less polarized. More polarized or inside more negative. So in short, it's hyperpolarizing graded potential, or less polarized, inside less negative, depolarizing graded potential. So medyo lito pa, di ba? Inside more negative, when you make it more negative, it's hyperpolarizing, more negative. When it reacts as less negative, so less negative, although negative pa rin, pero less na lang negative niya. For example, may nagdag na positive na less negative, we're depolarizing graded potential. Okay? We'll understand this with this one. Okay? Better. Most graded potentials occur in dendrites and cell bodies that are colored in blue. Okay? Graded potential. Remember graded potential, yung potential or the message that can be spread but in short distances lang because they eventually die out. Okay. Here, hyperpolarizing graded potential. Ano yung hyperpolarizing graded potential? Inside more negative. So this is in the membrane potential in millivolts. The inside is more negative. Okay. Resting membrane the resting membrane potential is at negative 70. However, sa inside niya, okay, the graded potential inside is more negative. Bumaba, more negative na. Mas dumami ang negative. As compared to your depolarizing graded potential, Okay? The inside is less negative, no? Resting potential at -70, naging more positive, no? More positive pero negative pa rin siya. -60. More positive kasi nadagdagan siya ng positive kaya siya naging less negative. Nagets lang, no? Sa math. So resting membrane potential at -70, however, the inside is became less negative. That's the polarizing graded potential. Okay. In short, more negative, hyperpolarizing. Less negative or more positive, depolarizing graded potential. Okay. Balik-balikin nyo na lang. Okay? Balik-balikan. Okay. Let's proceed to the generation of graded potentials in response to the opening of mechanically gated channels or ligand-gated channels. Okay? So ano ngayon ulit? Hyperpolarizing, naging more negative. Depolarizing, naging more positive or less negative. Okay. Diba? So, a graded potential forms in response to the opening of mechanically gated channels or ligand-gated channels. So, let's deal this one with these pictures. Okay, again, let's get oriented. Extracellular, plasma membrane, cytosol. Okay, so mechanically gated channel is closed when there is applied pressure. Applied pressure, the calcium and sodium ions go inside. Anong 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 effect? Sodium and calcium ions go inside. So mas dumami yung positive inside, right? Mas dumami yung positive inside. That's depolarizing graded potential. Why? Because the voltage or the electrical charge here became more positive or less negative, right? More positive or less negative, depolarizing graded potential. Okay. So, ayun. Because of the flow inside of the calcium and the sodium, okay, naging more positive dito, kaya depolarizing graded potential. Okay, next. Ligand-gated na naman tayo, acetylcholine. So because of here, the ligand-gated channel are closed. So binding of acetylcholine, nag-open na, di ba? Open na. So there would be inflow of the sodium and calcium and outflow of potassium. However, more ang sodium dito na pumapasok, no? More ang sodium na pumapasok with this one as compared to the influx of calcium and outflow of potassium. In short, naging positive pa rin dito because of the sodium influx. Because of the sodium influx. In short, this is still a depolarizing graded potential. More positive or less negative siya. Naging less negative siya because of the inflow of the positively charged sodium. Okay? Then here is a third example, hyperpolarizing graded potential caused by neurotransmitter glycine ligand stimulus. So here, close ang ligand-gated channel. When binding of glycine to your ligand-gated channel, it opens because glycine is a ligand stimulus. So chloride goes inside. Chloride is negatively charged. So that makes the the electrical charge here more negative. Kaya hyperpolarizing graded potential siya. The inside is more negative. Mas dumami because of the chloride ions which are negatively charged. So that's hyperpolarizing graded potential. Okay? Hopefully you understood depolarizing and hyperpolarizing graded potential. The graded nature of graded potentials are as follows. The amplitude of a graded potential depends on the stimulus strength. The greater the stimulus strength, ang strength ng stimulus or stimuli, the larger the amplitude of graded potential. No? So for example, the stimulus, strength niya hanggang dito lang. So stimulus 1 up to 3, mas nagiging mas malakas yung stimulus. The result would be a larger amplitude of the graded potential. No? Because of the stimulus, so in short, it's the membrane potential, amplitude of the graded potential is directly proportional to the strength of the stimulus. The larger or the bigger or the more strength you apply, the larger, the bigger, the more amplitude the graded potential will have. Okay. What is summation of the graded potentials? Summation occurs when two or more graded potentials add together to become larger in amplitude. No? So this happens when the stimulus happens at the same time or really close with one another. No? So kung hindi sila, walang summation, for example, you have a stimulus here, so meron siyang amplitude change. Another stimulus may change din kung individual lang sila. However, because they are close to one another and then summation happens, the resulting amplitude of the membrane potential is higher. No? Mas higher siya because of summation. Okay, kung individual lang at separate times, ito lang stimulus 1, separate times stimulus 2, ganyan lang rin. But however, in summation, because they happen closely in time, close to one another, summation happens. Okay, so the amplitude became larger. Okay, we're done with the graded potential. Graded potential, short lang, they die out eventually. Let's proceed to action potential or impulse. Okay. What's an action potential? It's a sequence of rapidly occurring events that decrease and reverse the membrane potential and then eventually restore it to the resting state. Again, action potential, sequence siya. May sequence na fina-follow. Rapidly occurring events that decrease the decrease and reverse the membrane potential and then eventually restore it to the resting state. Reverse, then babalik to resting state. So, resting state muna tayo. No? Let's discuss the resting state. All voltage gated, let's discuss. Get oriented with the picture. Extracellular, the plasma membrane, and you have here your cytosol, and you have here a potassium, and a sodium channel. Closed pareho. Activation gate is closed for the sodium channel and inactivated and inactivation gate open for the sodium channel. So all voltage gated sodium and potassium channels are closed. The axon plasma membrane is at resting membrane potential. Small buildup of negative charges along inside surface of membrane and an equal buildup of positive charges along outside surface of membrane. So there's a build-up, negative and positive. As mentioned nga, merong leakage. No? So an initial event or stimulus is required. Now, so resting state here, this is the membrane potential in millivolts. This is time in milliseconds. So in resting state, negative 70 muna tayo. Negative 70. Maintain at negative 70 resting membrane potential. Resting membrane potential. When there is an initial event or a stimulus that happens, this triggers the resting membrane potential to become more permeable to sodium. No? More permeable to sodium. Causes enough sodium to enter the cell so that the cell membrane reaches the threshold of negative 55 millivolts. Okay? So here, because of the stimulus, it triggers the resting membrane to become more permeable to sodium. Sodium goes inside. No? So what happens when there is more sodium inside? The resting membrane potential is now less negative, no? Because nag-add ka ng positive. Negative 55 millivolts na, no? From negative 70 to negative 55. So if so, the following event occurs. Action potential spreads along the neuron or muscle fiber. So there, action potential spreads na, no? So from negative 70 stimulus, more sodium goes inside, less negative na, it reaches the threshold. No, once it reaches the threshold, action potential spreads along the neuron or muscle fiber. So what happens? Action potential has two main phases. No, depolarizing phase and a repolarizing phase. Depolarizing and a repolarizing phase. Depolarize na. Ano ngayon kanina depolarize? More positive or less negative siya. Depolarizing. Nag-add ka ng more positive. Okay? What happens in the depolarizing phase? When membrane potential of axon reaches threshold, no? Action potential reaches threshold, negative 55 millivolts. The sodium channel activation gates open. As sodium ions move through these channels into the neuron, a buildup of positive charges forms along inside the surface of the membrane and the membrane becomes depolarized. No? Sodium goes inside, more positive ang nasa loob natin. Nasa loob natin. Okay, inside. So in the polarizing phase, sodium channels open. As more sodium ions enter the cell, membrane potential rises and become more positive. Negative 70, negative 55 threshold, may action potential na until it reaches 0 to positive 30 millivolts. Okay? Naging more positive. Then we proceed with the repolarizing phase. So what happens in the repolarizing phase? Sodium channels inactivation gates close, no? Close. And potassium channels open. So what happens when potassium channels open? So the membrane starts to become repolarized as some potassium ions leave the neuron and a few negative charges begin to build up along the inside surface of the membrane. No, nagiging more negative na because when potassium channels open, hindi naman ang potassium ang pumapasok, but the potassium goes outside because there are more potassium inside. So lumalabas siya. Okay? So that makes the inside more negative in a way because more potassium goes outside. Potassium, positively charged, goes outside. It makes the inside cytosol more negative. No? So there would be repolarizing phase, no? Pababa na. More negative na naman kasi nga of the potassium going outside. No? So potassium channels open in repolarizing phase. As more potassium ions leave the cell, membrane potential is returned to resting value. So up to positive 30, from positive 30 to 0 to negative 70. No? So may overshoot sometimes. We call it as after hyperpolarizing phase. Like hindi kagad na nabalik sa resting membrane potential which is negative 70 sumobra kasi maybe more potassium ang nag-exit, no, and then mas madami ang mas naging more negative than negative 70 yung voltage, electrical charge inside, kaya merong after hyperpolarizing phase, no, may overshoot. So in repolarization, potassium outflow continues. As more potassium ions leave the neuron, more negative charges build up along the inside surface of the membrane, and potassium outflow eventually restores resting membrane potential. Naging negative 17 na ang membrane potential natin, and then the sodium channel activation gate closes. Na? Sodium channel activation gate closes and inactivation gate opens. Return to resting state when potassium gate closes. So balik sa resting phase na naman. No? Here. So recovery, levels of ions back to normal by activation of the sodium potassium pump, and refractory period is brief. Even with adequate stimulus, cell cannot be activated. What does this mean? During these phases here, no? Say green, this one, and this one here, there are absolute refractory period and refractory period. What does this mean? Refractory period. Even when there is a new stimulus here, even when there is adequate stimulus, cell cannot be activated. No. So that's the refractory period. Here there is absolute refractory period. Absolute refractory period. Walang stimulus talaga na maka-activate sa cell. However, here in the relative refractory period, the cell can be activated once the stimulus is more than the needed stimulus, stimulus. No, more stimulus is needed for the activation of the cell in the relative refractory period. Okay. Ayun. So this summarizes the events that happened and what we discussed, no? So here to start is the resting membrane potential. Voltage-gated sodium channels are in resting state and voltage-gated potassium channels are closed. So walang movement. Okay. Here, the stimulus causes depolarization to threshold. Nag-depolarize na, more positive or less negative. No, more positive or less negative. Nag-depolarize until it reaches the threshold. Once there is threshold, it reaches threshold, there will be action potential na. No? So it will start with depolarizing, then repolarizing phase. So here, why is there more positive? It reaches positive 30 because voltage-gated sodium channel activation gates are open. Remember, the sodium goes inside. Kaya naging more positive. Here, sa repolarizing phase, sa first part, voltage-gated potassium channels are open. So meaning potassium goes out. So less negative here. And sodium channels are inactivating. No? Inactivating na start na inactivate. So less sodium ang pumapasok. So more potassium ang lumalabas. So naging less negative. Until such time it reaches this phase, no, voltage-gated potassium channels are still open and sodium channels are in the resting phase na. Until such time na pwedeng mag-hyperpolarize na, mag-overshoot. And then once everything goes back to the resting phase, the resting membrane potential is recovered. So -17 na naman. Okay? So all or non-principal. If a stimulus is strong enough to cause depolarization to threshold, if the stimulus here is strong enough to cause depolarization to threshold level, the impulse will travel the entire length of the neuron at a constant and maximum strength. No, all or non-principal. Kung hindi mag-reach ng threshold, there will be an impulse that would travel. But if the stimulus is strong enough that will depolarize and then that will reach the threshold, then it will be sure that the impulse will travel the entire length of the neuron. Once the stimulus depolarizes and reaches the threshold, which is -55 millivolts. So let's talk about the propagation of action potential. What is propagation? This is the movement, the conduction, no? The nerve impulse conduction, propagation. When sodium ions flow in, they cause voltage-gated sodium channels in adjacent segments of the membrane to open. No? When sodium ions flow in, they cause voltage-gated sodium channels in the adjacent segment of the membrane to open. No? Flow inside. Yung malapit na sodium channels, adjacent segment, they open also. So, mag-open, open, open, open. So, adjacent lang na segments. Action potential travels along the membrane rather like the activity of the long row of dominoes. Okay? Makita ko lang later. Okay? Hindi siya domino, hindi lang siya domino ang action potential. Long siya. Along the there would be, ano ba nito? Sige lang, mas makita ninyo later. Types of conduction, continuous and saltatory conduction. Continuous conduction happens in unmyelinated fibers. Walang myelin sheath sa axons nila. So, slower form of conduction because nga, when there is no myelin sheath, when it is unmyelinated axon, no, slow ang conduction talaga. Slow ang propagation, slow ang spread ng impulse, slow ang spread ng message. Okay? But in saltatory conduction, this happens in myelinated fibers. So meaning conduction is fast. Okay? The spread of the message is fast because of the myelin sheath made by your oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system, Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system. So faster as impulses leap between the nodes of Ranvier. Remember the nodes of Ranvier, okay, or Ranvier? They just leap, no? Leap, lukso, between the nodes of Ranvier. Kaya mabilis ang nerve impulse in saltatory conduction with myelinated fibers because the impulse leaps, jumps. So what are the factors that increase the rate of conduction? It's the amount of myelination. The more the nerve, the axon is myelinated, the faster the rate of conduction, mas mabilis. More myelin sheath, mas mabilis. The larger the axon diameter, mas mabilis. And the more warm ang nerves, mas mabilis. If cold, mabagal. Okay, so these are the factors that increase rate of conduction. The amount of myelin, the size of the axon, and the temperature should be warm. Okay, propagation of an action potential in a neuron after it arises at the trigger zone. Again, the trigger zone is located in between, in most neurons, in between the axon hillock and the initial segment. Yeah, di ba? So here, action hillock and the initial segment. So as mentioned, in continuous conduction, no, continuous unmyelinated axons exhibit continuous conduction, this one. Myelinated axons exhibit saltatory conduction. So these are two separate conduction types, no? Continuous conduction, saltatory conduction. Continuous conduction, no? So yun nga, influx of sodium will influence the adjacent sodium channels, yung malapit na sodium channels to also open until sunod-sunod na siya, no? So mabagal. So for example, dalawa, open din siya. Open, open. Okay? So ayun. So the current flow due to opening of the sodium channels. Pag ganun. So step-by-step depolarization and repolarization of each adjacent segment of the plasma membrane. Adjacent. Yung magkalapit lang. Kaya siya slow. Mabagal. No? As compared to your saltatory conduction, no? The opening will just leap, no? From this one to the nodes of Ranvier. Leaping of the action potential. The action potential appears to leap from node to node as each nodal area depolarizes to threshold. Okay? So jump, 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 jump. Ganyan. Kaya mas mabilis as compared to unmyelinated. Ito may myelin, no? Kaya may nodes of Ranvier, the areas that have no myelin sheath, no? Kaya siya mabilis. Leaping lang, saltatory. As compared to dito, mabagal, no? Influence lang adjacent sodium channels. Okay? So this is just to classify the nerve fibers. We have A, B, and C fibers. Largest would be your A, myelinated na ang A. So sensory neurons, they are sensory neurons and motor neurons, merong A fibers. No? B fibers also myelinated, but they are smaller as compared to your A fibers. Longer absolute refractory period than A fibers. And then sensory nerve impulses and all axons of the autonomic nervous system have B fibers. And then C fibers, the smallest. And then it's the only fiber among the A, B, and C that is unmyelinated. Longest absolute refractory period, and they are present in the sensory impulse of the following, and the autonomic motor fibers that simulate the heart, muscles, and the glands. Okay? Biggest, myelinated, pero mas maliit, the smallest, and then unmyelinated. ABC fibers. Ayun, this is just a table to compare the graded potential and the action potential. Arise mainly in dendrites and cell body. Action potentials arise in the trigger zones in between the axon hillock and the initial segment and propagate along the axon. Ligand gated or mechanically gated ion channels. Voltage gated usually for sodium and potassium. Decremental, not propagated. Decremental meaning they just die out ang graded potential. Permit communication over short distance only. Graded potential. Action potentials propagate and thus permit communication over long distances. Amplitude depending on the strength of the stimulus, ang action potential or none. Depending on the bigger the strength of the stimulus, the bigger the amplitude, di ba, sa graded potential. While in action potential, all or none, if it reaches the threshold. Duration typically longer, shorter lang kasi nga may mas mabilis. Polarity may be hyperpolarizing or depolarizing. Always consists of depolarizing phase followed by repolarizing phase. No? After the stimulus, the threshold, then depolarizing, then hyperpolarizing. sa action potential. Refractory period not present, summation can occur. Present, summation cannot occur. Present ang refractory period, so merong absolute and the relative refractory periods in your action potentials. Okay, break time. Observe the picture. Pwede pala to. Okay. I'd be a disaster without you. Kulang brain, disaster talaga ang heart. Okay? Especially for the autonomic nervous system that plays a part in the sympathetic and parasympathetic effects of the heart. Sympathetic, increase the contractility of the heart, and the heart pumps faster, causing tachycardia or abnormally increase in the rate of the heart rate per minute. While parasympathetic nervous system, the effects of the heart would be bradycardia, term that refers to less than normal number of beats per minute. Normal heart rate per minute would be 60 to 100. Tachycardia would be more than that. And less than 60 would be bradycardia. Okay? So I'd be a disaster without you. Huh? So sinong iniisip ninyo? So comment down below kung sino ang person that you could say that I'd be a disaster without you. Okay? Para may char. Okay? Let's proceed. Okay, so now I mentioned a while ago neurotransmitters, no? So same siya. Same. Same. So we'll talk about the signal transmission at synapses. No? At synapses, this is the synapse. So what are synapses? What is a synapse? It's a region where communication occurs between two neurons. So this one is in between two neurons, the picture. You have a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron. No? Or synapse pa rin ang tawag between a neuron and an effector cell. It could either be between a neuron and a muscle cell or a neuron and a glandular cell. Synapse pa rin ang in between. Tawag pa rin nun. No. So here, synapse is in between communication between two neurons, a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron. What's a presynaptic neuron? No, refers to a nerve cell that carries a nerve impulse toward a synapse. Nerve impulse carry niya towards a synapse, papuntang synapse. It is the cell that sends a signal. In this particular picture, ang sinesend niya is the neurotransmitter, the one stored in vesicles, synaptic vesicles. These still are messages that are, the neurotransmitters are still messages that are needed to be released in the synapse, the synaptic cleft, the space in between the two neurons, no? So that these messages interact with the receptors that are found in the postsynaptic neuron, so that it can stimulate an action. So it could either excite or inhibit depending on the neurotransmitter or depending on the receptor that it activates. Okay. So sa postsynaptic neuron, it is the cell or the neuron that receives the signal, the neurotransmitter. It may be a nerve cell that carries a nerve impulse away from the synapse, or an effector cell that responds to the impulse at the synapse. So effector cell, muscle or glandular cell. Okay, so presynaptic neuron, the end of the axon at the axonal terminal, synaptic end bulb. Ayan. So the messages are or the neurotransmitters are stored in synaptic vesicles. Ayan. Examples of synapses between two neurons. Okay, it could either be the axon ends and synapses at another neuron, at another axon, I mean. So it's called term as axoaxonic neuron. No? A synapse, axoaxonic. Or an axon that synapses with a dendrite. It's termed as axodendritic. Or an axon that has synapse, no, with directly to a cell body, no, a neuron. No, so axosomatic. Remember soma, body, cell body. Axosomatic. So that's axonic, axon to axon, axodendritic, axon to dendrites, axosomatic, axon to cell body. So just different types. Axosecretory, axon terminal secretes directly into the bloodstream, no? Or nutrients coming from the blood towards the axon. Axoaxonic, axon to an axon. Axodendritic, axon to a axon to an axon. Axon to a dendrite, axodendritic. Axon extracellular, just an axon with no connection. Then axosomatic, axon terminal ends on a soma, cell body. Axosynaptic, axon terminal ends on another axon terminal. So it's different types. These are especially present in our brain. So synaptic transmission, similar sequence of events occur at the synapse, neuron to neuron, neuromuscular junction, neuron to muscle fiber, neuroglandular junction, neuron to gland, as mentioned. No? So similar sequence of events occur, triggered by an action potential, a nerve impulse. So the release, we will learn later that the release of the we will learn later that the release of the uh, neurotransmitter will be triggered by an action potential. Then components of a synapse, there will be a sending neuron, presynaptic neuron, which releases the neurotransmitter. There needs to be a space between neurons. Wala na. Okay, sorry, synaptic left. And then there would be a receiving neuron at the postsynaptic neuron. No, so here we would be able to see everything. This is the presynaptic neuron. This is the synaptic cleft, the space in between the two neurons. This is the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so the signal transmission at the chemical synapse. Okay, so yun nga, one neuron, nerve impulse sent towards another neuron. So what happens here at the end? So ang end niya, this one. This one, presynaptic dito sa postsynaptic neuron. So at a chemical synapse, a presynaptic neuron converts an electrical signal, nerve impulse into a chemical signal neurotransmitter. Chemical synapse, a presynaptic neuron converts an electrical signal, the nerve impulse. No, nerve impulse, mag-propagate siya, di ba dito? Nerve impulse hanggang mag-reach siya dito. And at the end, no, the nerve impulse will be converted to an electrical signal, from an electrical signal to a chemical signal, which is the neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter. Okay. The postsynaptic neuron then converts the chemical signal. Postsynaptic neuron converts the chemical signal, which is the neurotransmitter, no, kung meron ng interaction, back into an electrical signal post-synaptic potential na. No? Electrical signal to a chemical signal, chemical signal, chemical signal to a electrical signal postsynaptic potential. Okay? So what happens? So an action potential arrives at the presynaptic neuron and bulb. No? Action potential arrives at the presynaptic neurons and bulb. Ayun na. From here, nagpropagate na, and then the action potential na the nerve impulse reaches here. No? So it opens voltage-gated calcium channels and calcium flows into the presynaptic cytosol because these are voltage-gated calcium channels, no? Because of the change, depolarization caused by the nerve impulse at the synaptic end bulb, calcium voltage gated calcium channels open. No? So what happens? Calcium will flow inside. No? So there would be more depolarization here, no? Because of the positively charged calcium ions, and these will be signals that will make the synaptic vessel membrane, no, the membrane of the vessel, fuse with the presynaptic membrane, no? Ang membrane nito ng synaptic vesicle which stores the neurotransmitter will fuse with the membrane of the presynaptic membrane, no? So there would be exocytosis of the neurotransmitter. Okay? So, ang neurotransmitter natin now would be available in the synaptic cleft. And then they will interact with the receptors, their corresponding receptors at the postsynaptic membrane. No? So, once na nag-interact na, the chemical signal will now be converted to a postsynaptic potential, and once it reaches a threshold, it will now be converted to a nerve impulse. Okay? So, action potential arrives, opens the voltage calcium channels, opens. The calcium flows into the presynaptic cytosol. Yan, meron ng calcium. Increase in calcium concentration will trigger the synaptic vesicles to fuse with the presynaptic membrane. So there would be, membrane, and then there will be exocytosis of the neurotransmitters towards the synaptic exocytosis of synaptic vesicles, no, of the neurotransmitter. Now the neurotransmitter released into the cleft, and the neurotransmitter diffuses across clefts and binds to the receptors in the postsynaptic membrane. And the neurotransmitter serves as chemical trigger, the stimulus of ion channels. And the postsynaptic cell membrane may be depolarized or hyperpolarized, depends on the type nga again of the neurotransmitter and the type of postsynaptic cell. And if the threshold is reached, then the postsynaptic cell action potential results. Postsynaptic potential results then leads to the nerve impulse action potential again. Okay? Naintindihan lang ba? Comment down below. Okay. Internalize nyo muna and then I'll repeat. This is between a neuron and another neuron. This is presynaptic. This is the one that will give the neurotransmitter. This is the postsynaptic, the one that will receive the message, the neurotransmitter. Yun, na-propagate na yung impulse, no? And then it reaches the axon terminal. At the synaptic end bulb, no, the nerve impulse, because of the changes in the voltage, it will open the calcium-gated channels. There would be influx of calcium. And because of the influx of calcium, it's a signal that will cause the synaptic vesicles to fuse yung bumabalot yung vesicle, mag-fuse siya with the presynaptic membrane. This causes the exocytosis of the neurotransmitters. Release siya sa synaptic cleft, no? Yan. Until such time that the neurotransmitters will interact with the receptors at the postsynaptic membrane, no? Ito, yung neurotransmitter na yan. And then because of this, it will activate or open the receptors, no, or the channel. Thus, in this type, sodium will go inside, no. Then once it reaches a threshold, then there would be postsynaptic potential that will later trigger a nerve impulse. Okay? Then continue na naman, nerve impulse na naman, propagate na naman until it will reach the structure that it needs to activate so that it could interpret, and then interpret or decide which action should be made. No? So, in short, sa motor, ganito pa rin ang in both sensory and motor and interneuron, this could be used, as seen a while ago. So, ayan. So, maybe I could repeat na lang ulit yung the picture wherein the man is holding the sige, balik na lang tayo. Okay. Ayun, kasi na-discuss na natin lahat. The graded potential, the nerve action potential, and the muscle action potential. So because of the sensory receptor here, there would be production of a graded potential that will activate an action potential. So there would be propagation, no? Propagation na. Then until it reaches the central nervous system at the posterior sensory nerve, because posterior ang sensory nerve, until such time dito the axon will interact with the postsynaptic neuron, the interneuron here, through neurotransmitter release, and then with the neurotransmitter release, there will be activation of a graded potential, again, that will stimulate a nerve action potential, no? Then successive ganun ang mangyayari, graded potential, action potential, then release of neurotransmitter until the signal will reach its the needed structure for the interpretation. So in this case, it's the cerebral cortex because it's where the perception happens. Now that you know that you're holding a pen and your hand is on the table on the paper ready to write. And then there would be propagation of the graded potential again in the upper motor neuron, then action potential, until such time there would be a release of the neurotransmitter or interaction between the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron, then may graded potential na naman, then action potential, at it will have an interaction with the skeletal muscles through the neuromuscular junction. Neuromuscular junction, same lang pa rin. Neuron and a muscle cell. Okay? May synapse pa rin. And there would be release of the neurotransmitter, and then there would be making of the muscle action potential. Until such time, yun na nga, may motor neuron na magko-contract sa muscles para mag-write. Okay? Hopefully, that was Understandable. Okay. So synaptic transmission is a one-way transmission only because one-way lang siya. Because only presynaptic cells release the neurotransmitter. Only postsynaptic cells receive the have receptors for the neurotransmitter binding. No? Then finally, neurotransmitters must be removed from the cleft, no? Through three mechanisms. Diffusion out of the cleft, aalisin doon sa space in between the neurons. Destruction by enzymes like acetylcholinesterase enzyme in the cleft. Acetylcholinesterase enzyme will deactivate the acetylcholine that is found in the synaptic cleft by cleaving the acetylcholine into acetate and choline. No? So, hindi na siya acetylcholine, hindi na siya pwedeng mag-activate or work as a neurotransmitter because of the acetylcholinesterase. Then, third would be transferred back, recycling into presynaptic cell. Like in acetylcholine nga, the choline part can be recycled and be transported back to the presynaptic cell for making again acetylcholine in the presynaptic neuron. Ayan. So we have different neurotransmitters. Ayan. They're messages pa rin sila, no? And they are stored in vesicles in the presynaptic neuron. And we have acetylcholine, common in the peripheral nervous system, stimulatory on skeletal muscles, inhibitory on cardiac muscles. We have amino acids, different amino acids that act as neurotransmitters, glutamate, aspartate, your gamma aminobutyric acid, your GABA, which is inhibitory, glycine, no? Mentioned natin kanina. Then modified amino acids or biogenic amines, your norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, no? Norepinephrine is also termed as your noradrenaline. Then you have your neuropeptides such as endorphins, nitric oxide. So these are just the main goal for this is just to really be acquainted, no? Para ila-ila, gamay. These are neurotransmitters that could be stored in vesicles that could act as messages, no, from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron, and they have their corresponding effects to the body. Iba-iba ang effects nila depending on the receptor, depending whether they are inhibitory or whether they are excitatory neurotransmitters. Yeah, it's always so difficult getting back to work after a vacation. Comment down below if it is true or not. My secret is I'm always on vacation. So hopefully you also learn how to rest and digest like your parasympathetic nervous system. Chill, even though there are responsibilities. But of course, you need to also do your responsibilities. Okay, so thank you. That will be all for now. Okay, thank you and have a great day.